Lynette Alexander, and I grew up in a family. We were 3 girls, and much later my brother was born. My dad got transferred in his work, so we moved around a lot in what was the old Transvaal.
I also grew up in a family with 4 children. I was the second one, 3 boys and then a girl, just the other way around. Very loving and stable family. Born and brought up in Johannesburg, except for a few years on the Free State goldfields in Welkom. My dad worked for the President Brunt mine as an accountant. Then he joined a Roberts construction company, actually, and came back to Johannesburg. And that's where effectively my childhood was spent. Went to school there, went to university there, worked there for many years before coming to Cape Town in the early 1990s.
I went to work straight after school, but then later when the children were young, I did a degree through UNISA, a BA degree. I didn't really follow a career. I spent most of the time looking after the kids.
I'm now technically an emeritus professor at the University of Cape Town, which simply means that I'm superannuated in retirement, but I do continue to occupy a part-time research occupation or position called a senior research scholar. So they've retained me on contract. I'm now on the second of my 3-year contracts, which means I get still to work with postgrad students and do the stuff I really love doing.
Well, we had 2 boys, Andrew and Ryan. Andrew was born in 81 and Ryan in 84. They both came to Cape Town with us. They both studied at UCT. Andrew was more like me. He studied English and history. Ryan more like Mark. He studied, in fact, civil engineering. Mark actually taught him. And then tragically in 2007, Andrew was killed in a car crash when he was 26 years old. I think he'd often thought about something like journalism, because he also studied English. He majored in English and history in his first degree. He'd only worked for about 6 months when he died, and he'd worked for a company where it was almost like working for a newspaper, although everything was online. And I think that's probably the route he would have gone if he hadn't died. Yeah.
I think he wanted to be a travel journalist.
Yes, he loved traveling. He had traveled a lot. And he wrote very, very well. His English was superb. Yeah. Interesting enough, India was a place he visited twice. He took a gap year after matric and did the discipleship training course with YWAM. And then they always do a trip, and so he went to India for that. And then again, after he'd completed his master's degree, he took some months and went back to India again, as well as some of the other countries in the East. But the East always fascinated him. I remember even as a young boy, he liked to read about the Mongols and people like that, sort of unusual interest.
Well, as an engineer, you usually have to get a certain amount of practical experience in different fields. So he joined a consulting company that had partly sponsored his studies. And then after 18 months, went and worked for a contracting company. In fact, built some of the Gauteng freeway bridges during that very large Gauteng freeway improvement project. And then won a scholarship to Cambridge and went to Cambridge for a year and did a master's degree in sort of sustainability and engineering, an MPhil, Master of Philosophy, at the University of Cambridge. Then came back and landed up more or less in the same consulting company, which changed its name over time, but he continues to work in that consulting company in Cape Town. He's actually very much a people's person. So he's not that backroom engineer wielding a pencil and designing things. He loves interacting with people. So the job he does now, he interacts a lot with clients, with the city, with communities, putting projects together, being that kind of in-between guy that makes things happen between different parties and projects. So he sort of found his niche in a way as a people person, but within an engineering context.
It's just too awful to describe. I think we all know these things happen because they happen, but you somehow always think that it happens to others. And I remember the night when we got the phone call, we were having coffee in a coffee shop in Kalk Bay, and all the way back in the car, driving back to our home, I kept saying, how can it be? How can it be? Because it just didn't seem possible. So it really is just one of the most difficult things I think that can happen. And I know life is full of tragedies, and this is not the only tragedy. But it was just a gut-wrenching shock. Yeah.
As Lynn said, we say, why me, Lord? Well, I think the question is, why not me? Why should it not happen to me? I mean, we live in a world that is fallen. And just to be a Christian doesn't insulate you from a fallen world. So we should expect to go through life-wrenching experiences, I think. Or at least we should not expect to avoid them. But it was like a devastating explosion in our hearts and in our lives. It just ripped us apart for a while and really put our faith, I think, quite severely to the test. It shook our confidence. Does God really care? Is God really in control? If so, why? The why questions always come. And slowly, I think, God just helps us to process what we could understand and leave with Him what we couldn't understand. And there's a lot we still can't understand. But we're happy to leave that in that realm of one day we'll find it. That will be made clear and make our peace with that. Well, Andrew was working late one Friday night. They were on sort of call. He was on call that weekend in case news items came in that he had to process. And we think that he left the office, which was in Westlake Park, drove down towards the M3, realized he had left the laptop at work, which he needed, went back, and in going back to the office up Steenberg Boulevard or Steenberg Road, a guy in a big, powerful Porsche overtook on a double white line around a bend, and he was drunk, and he took Andrew out in a head-on. He just didn't have a chance, so he was virtually dead on impact. That guy survived. We had to face him in court some months later when the case came to court. So it was really tough because he had survived and Andrew hadn't. Well, not really, because they fumbled the alcohol test, so they couldn't prove that he was over the legal limit, but clearly he had been because people saw him. So they couldn't bring a case of drunken driving against him, and in the end they fined him 60,000 rand, which doesn't bring a son back. And then we had to fight with him to get compensation for the car, because he wrote off Andrew's car, and we thought that he should at least pay for that. Eventually he did, and we took that money and put it into a bursary fund. We didn't want the money, we just felt on principle he should pay, and then we put it into a bursary fund which then helped other young people.
Well, I think time helps. I mean, it doesn't bring Andrew back. I don't think it changes the awfulness of having lost a son. But I think with time you learn to live. It's, as somebody wrote a book once called it a new kind of normal. And I think you learn to live with that new kind of normal. But I mean, never a day goes by that you don't think how wonderful it would have been to have Andrew. But you do learn to live with it, I think. Yeah.
Yes, you say to take the sting out of it. There is still a sting. But the sting is not as sharp as it was. That early period was so sharp and so painful. And that pain has indeed subsided. But the memory remains. But what we're so grateful for is that those are good memories. You know, one of my first words to Lynn that very night when it happened was that, you know, all the memories are good. And for that we're very grateful. So we live with good memories. I must say that something that took a sting out of it for us was not only our family, but the church family, because we don't have any immediate family in Cape Town. They're all remote. They did come to our aid, of course, but in the meantime and continually, because the family were there for a week and then they were gone. Over that whole period, the church rallied and supported and got around us and never stopped loving us. And it was at that point that I realized how important church was. That suddenly we're enveloped by a family, another family, that actually helped to sustain us. And at times like that, In fact, C.S. Lewis has said sometimes in the good times of life, God seems so present. In the bad times of life, he seems so absent. And it was almost as if he seemed absent, but he was present through his church to us. And I've seen other people die and not have that experience of having church around them to give them what they needed at that time, that bitter time. And we were so very, very grateful for that. I also want to add this in. When I talk about the church family, we also especially want to recognize that Jeff and Wendy came back all the way from Zambia to just to be with us. That meant the world and still means the world.
If you were to speak to somebody who's been bereaved in a tragic way, when an old man dies, it's one thing, sort of a completeness. But when a young person who's just graduated with their master's degree and has their life ahead of them dies, something's wrong somewhere. What would you say to someone who feels something's wrong?
Well, it is wrong, and it's wrong because the world is wrong. I think that's what Mark was saying when he was talking about things not being as they should be. And I think that's why I don't think I ever was in danger of losing my faith, because I've seen tragedy happen to so many wonderful people, so many wonderful Christians, and I realize this is the world, this is the broken world we live in. All I can say to them is that just hang in there, because God is with you and God will see you through this. And you know, the difficulty I remember in those early days is you sometimes wished you could go to bed and wake up in a year's time. And of course you can't. That's the thing. You have to live through each day after each day after each day. But with time, you do find that you manage, because God is there. I mean, I remember one Sunday, we came home from church, and we'd always, the four of us had sat down and had tea together after church. And now we were sitting down, it was the three of us, and it was just such a hole, because Andrew wasn't there, and I didn't feel well, and I went to lie down, and I really felt so anxious, and I thought I was going to just lose it. And I just remember calling on God, because I thought, I can't do this to Mark and Ryan. I can't now also collapse in a heap and have to end up in hospital or something. And as I lay there was just such a peace that came upon me. And it didn't change anything. When I woke up after my rest, Andrew was still gone. But I just knew God was there, and that if he could do that for me in that moment when I just felt so anxious and as if I could just collapse and have a breakdown of some sort, I knew that he would be there the next day and the next day and the next day.
So you just got to keep on keeping on.
Just got to keep on keeping on, yeah.
What would you say, Mark?
Well, what it has helped me to understand is the reality of suffering. Suffering is not something that we speak easily of or much of, because it's not a pleasant topic. But the Bible says through much suffering we must enter the kingdom of God. So in some way or another, every one of us will suffer. Every one of us watching this camera is going to suffer. That's for sure. And it's what we do with our suffering that really counts. And it occurs to me that it was only through the suffering of Jesus that God brought about the redemption of the world. And I think in many ways it's through the suffering of the people of God that God continues to work out his redemptive purposes in the world around us. It's a mystery. Paul talks about the mystery of suffering. And Peter Watt speaks about this, where he says that the devil threw everything he had at Jesus on the cross, and Jesus defeated him. So even evil is turned to the good, is turned to work for the purposes of God. Evil is captive now to the will of God. So God takes evil things, which include suffering, and turns them to the purpose of his will. That's a wonderful thing. Only the power of God could do a thing like that. And I think that's something of what I've come to understand a little bit. But only a little bit. I think at down bottom of it all, our faith held. God preserved us. And there's a wonderful statement by Julian of Norwich where he lands up saying that after all is said and done, he says, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. And that's a wonderful thing.